Hi guys, Office Bloke Dave here. I hope everyone out there is doing great today. I'm up bright and early, recording on a nice rainy Tuesday morning. Yeah, it's Tuesday. Yeah, summer is over in the UK. We had our little 3 weeks of summer, we had a bit of sunshine, and now it's 6 months of rain, snow, storms, whatever else wants to come, so exciting stuff. Right then, Bradley Hall, who I've followed for quite a while now, has released a video, what was the best decade ever for metal. It's a 10 minute 35 long video, which is the 1990s, obviously. Pantera, Slayer, Biohazard. I mean, there's not many other bands you really need to put in there. I know all those bands were pre and post 1990s, but I think the 80s glam rock thing and sort of power metal getting killed off in the early 90s, and bands getting heavier and everyone just wearing shirtless plaid shirts with camo shorts and stuff. That's my era of metal. I mean, Metallica was still pretty fucking good at that point as well. So 90s, 1990s, there you go. We don't have to watch the video. Let's check it out. Bradley Hall, what was the best decade for metal? Let's do it.
So here we are, once again, ready for another arbitrary tier list ranking. And today's point of order is to rank every single decade of metal thus far, from its humble beginnings in the 70s right through until this very day. So as you can see down here, we have our decades in order, ready to be scrutinized and ranked. We have a disco ball for the 70s, of course. We've got some, I don't know, miscellaneous synthwave bullshit for 80s. The rave smiley face for 90s. The MySpace logo for 2000s. God rest its soul. Mr. Trimp for 2010s, and the C word for 2020s. So we're just gonna run through each decade, reminisce a little bit, analyse the bands and the albums that came out of that period, and then smack them into a tier. But before we go any further, I'd like to take a brief moment to talk about the sponsor of today's video, okay? So, one of the questions I get asked all the time is, Bradley Hall, what pick do you use? What pick do you use? Bradley, what pick do you use? And my answer, Dan's Guitar Store. Then please do feel free to check out the link in the description down below. Alright then, starting off with the 70s. The OG decade of metal, your Black Sabbaths and your Judas Priests and your Deep Purple, Motorhead, Zeppelin, I guess not really metal bands. What is with some of these band names though? Suck, Toad, Bang, Dust. But there was actually a lot of good shit, more than I actually recalled initially. Like the first...
Toad, Suck, Bang, Dust would be a great name for a band nowadays. It has to be a crusty punk band. Toad, Suck, Bang, Dust.
Rainbow album, like the early Deep Purple stuff was fucking amazing. The early Judas Priest stuff was great. But the few classic albums aside, I know a lot of it was like a bit too primitive. The sound quality of like a lot of this stuff was just like pretty garbage. So obviously in terms of influence, the decade is S tier for sure. But if you're rating it on just like the music quality alone of like, the songs and the playing and all that stuff, I don't know, it's sort of like, it's somewhere in the middle, I would say. It's like a B. It's a strong B tier, I think, 70s. I think that's fair. Because if we do compare it to all the stuff that came after, then it's pretty lacking, I think, a lot of 70s stuff. But the influence, you gotta take it into account, because, all the stuff in the 70s laid the groundwork for the rest of the bands that would come after. Next up is the 80s. Probably the choice decade of most old school and like traditional metalheads. A lot of the most famous metal albums of all time came out in the 80s. Your Master of Puppets and and everyone suddenly became very, very good at their instruments in the 80s. The shredding and the tapping and the drummers were doing like the brrrr. Is it as amazing as a decade as you initially assume? In the 80s, you were kind of limited to what you had. You had like some thrash stuff, you had like the glam and hair metal stuff, which was huge. You had, I guess you had some like very early primitive death metal and stuff, but that was kind of it really. So 80s was definitely the era of the OG classic albums that everyone knows. Appetite for Destruction, Puppets, Rush, Heaven and Hell, Def Leppard, Operation Mindcrime, Holy Diver, lots of good.
To be fair, there's a lot of good albums on that list. But I think it was like things were getting good in the late 80s and then 90s.
Shit. Thing is though, I'm going to look at this as objectively as possible. A lot of the stuff that came out in this period is a bit of an acquired taste. You know, the 80s sound isn't for everyone. You know, everything being kind of like larger than life, like massive snares and their vocals like, ah! And loads of shredding. Definitely like a love it or hate it kind of thing. So, all of that being said, if you rate the 80s on just sheer amount of classic albums alone, then yeah, it's an S tier. But the fact that a lot of this music hasn't aged too well, sounds very dated and cheesy. And let's face it, a lot of these, like, you know, big classic hits from this time are like so overplayed. A lot of them are just so fucking unlistenable now. But that being said, there were so many fucking amazing classic albums in this time that you just can't discount that. 80s metal, strong A tier. Alright, moving on, we have the 90s. The decade in which I was spawned upon this earth and grew up as a little lad. So I think a lot of people just assume that, you know, grunge started in the 90s and then that's it, metal was wiped off the face of the earth and like, it didn't do anything, it just went into hibernation. But, holy shit, there was so much good fucking metal in the 90s. Let's have a look. I mean, just look at all this. We've got like Death, Deicide, Entombed, Painkiller, of course, Rust in Peace, Cowboys from Hell, yeah, you obviously had Pantera in the 90s, Morbid Angel, Mr. Bungle. You had the big Aussie stuff, Sepultura, of course. Even someone like the heavier side of grunge, like Soundgarden and Alice in Chains was fucking sick. Fucking Symphony X, Strapping Young Lad.
Strapping Young Lad in the 90s? Wow, I think I've heard one album and I absolutely loved it, but I didn't know they were around for that long. This is just is 90s for me. I forgot about Sepultura as well, which Sepultura with Max is Sepultura for me.
Oh my god, there was so much fucking good stuff. Everything just fucking exploded and like evolved in like 10,000 different directions. And in my opinion, it's the 90s that should be remembered in the way that the 80s are. Metal in the 80s was just sort of like having fun, making lots of money, just like pissing around, having a laugh. And then the 90s rolled around, it was just like, oi! Get the fuck off my porch! Stop messing about! We're doing it. The music that came out in this time was just so much more diverse. 90s was fucking MVP. It's going slap bang in S. So if the 90s was like the definitive classic era,
I think the 90s is where all the subgenres were developed and things just branched off and started going crazy. Yeah. And that's more for me, because I like Sepultura, Pantera, Slayer, Deicide. Like, there's so many bands there that I absolutely love. 2000s, I think, was one of the most iconic eras because of new metal and because of how big everything got. But musically, everything just got so simple and stripped back. Good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. Nostalgic for me, though. Like, first ever festival was in 2000, it was. Leeds 2000. Which makes me feel really old. Of
metal, then the 2000s was sort of like a bridge between the old school, like OG stuff, and the sort of like the more modern metal sound that we know today. It took what was going on in the 90s and just like fucking injected it with steroids. So let's see, we've got Anthems of Rebellion, Dope Throne, Ironworks, Blackbird, Songs of the Deaf, Way of All Flesh, Addicted, fucking sick album. Midian, Follow the Reaper, Obscene, Puritanical, The Sickness, Ashes of the Wake, Clayman, Blackwater Park, Brave New World even, End of Heartache, The Blackening, City of Evil.
Oh, this is causing me some issues now. I was thinking more of the new metal side of things in the early 2000s, but there were so many iconic albums that you just read out there. Shit.
White Pony, Toxicity, Iowa, Hybrid Theory. So the 2000s was pretty much the decade where all the bands that rose to prominence in the 90s had their fucking banger classic albums. The level of musicianship and songcrafting in this decade was just like amazing. Probably the best ever in my opinion. Bands of this period just knew how to write fucking bangers like left, right and centre. I would say that it's an S tier. The 2000s is for sure an S tier. Give it like another 10 years or so and I reckon that the 2000s will probably be held in regard as the best decade of metal. I reckon. Right, moving on. We've got 2010s, the Trimp. The late 2000s.
Is that Death playing in the background as well? I noticed the Pantera Cemetery Gates riff a second ago. But then I think he's just gone into death. Flesh and the power it holds.
2000s and like the early 2010s just sort of like bleed together for me. So I'm going to have to consult Google on this one. Got Behemoth, the Satanist, Ghost, Meliora, L'Enfant Sauvage, Septic Flesh, great mass. Oh, Power Trip, yeah, that's a fucking sick album. Oh, Fear Inoculum, no thank you. Yeah, the first Ghost album was fucking sick. Bring Me the Horizon, Sempiternal, good. Monolith of Inhumanity, Cattle Decap, probably my favourite death metal album of all time. Code Orange Forever, sick album. Gorguts, yeah, classic. So after looking at those, you can definitely notice the shift away from the more sort of like old school sounds and bands to the more contemporary stuff. The 2010s is also when we started to see a massive paradigm shift in the music industry, you know, away from the more sort of like traditional practices into a more internet and social media based world. I think this is definitely a contributing factor in why we saw a lot of like older bands fall off in the 2010s and a lot of younger bands start to rise. And it's mostly only really like the very, very big established bands that continue to go, you know, pretty strong during this decade. But where do we rank it? That's the problem. Maybe it's a bit unfair because like compared to the other decades, not as much time has passed. And you need a certain amount of time to pass before classic status gets, you know, stamped. So it's by no means a bad decade, but in terms of like influence and sheer amount of classic albums, I don't know, it's just doesn't compete with the 3 decades before. But I don't know, I still rate it better than the 70s. It's a strong B. Strong B tier. All right, so we arrive now in the current decade in which we are in right now.
Thing about this decade is it's like the decade of deathcore, isn't it? Like bands like Lorna Shore, Slaughter to Prevail have gone absolutely crazy. I'm not the biggest deathcore fan in the world. Just like I do love Lorna Shore. I think they're great. I'm going to go and see them live in December. I think musicianship wise, songwriting wise, we're in almost the peak of it at the moment. But in terms of it being my favourite, I don't think we're nowhere near it being my favourite decade.
So I wasn't really sure whether to include this because it doesn't seem very fair, seeing as we're only, like 3 years into it. So I tried to have a look at some of these lists, but they're not really very up to date, unfortunately. So I guess like the biggest albums so far we've had are like the Sleep Token album, the Spirit Box album we got here. The latest Trivium album, that was pretty good. Virus, Haken, that was good. Bleed the Future. Imperial Triumphant, one of my favourite bands personally, they're amazing. I Disagree, Poppy, I'm a big fan. Oh, Verminius, Black Dahlia Murder, 2020. Oh, Sons of Apollo as well, yeah. Despite the naysayers, I think metal is in a very, very healthy place right now. Probably stronger than it's been in a long, long time. So many crazy good bands doing very, very cool things with the genre and really pushing it to new heights. Not to mention the massive comeback that new metal is having at the moment. With the current trajectory, the 2020s are going to be a sick decade for metal. I reckon it's on course to be better than the 2010s for sure. So I think we're going to make our own little row here and call it Big Things Coming Soon. Put it in there. And there you have it, my definitive ranking of every decade of metal. What do you guys think of my picks? Agree? Disagree? Please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. And I shall see you again very, very soon.
I like Bradley, he makes good content. My go-to guitar YouTubers are Bradley Hall and Ola England. Every day they make me feel guilty about not playing guitar much anymore. Well, at all, really. And I keep saying I'm going to start picking up guitar again and playing, but there's just that spark's just gone. It went a long time ago. I'm hoping it comes back at some point. I don't know. The thing that used to get me out of a funk years ago was getting a new guitar, and then I'd just sit and noodle on it for ages. But I don't know. Yeah, I didn't mention for the 2020s Lorna Shore, who somehow, for a band as heavy as they are, seem to have transcended metal a little bit. And like non-metal people know who Will Ramos is. And it's weird. And like when I showed them to Ash, who isn't really a metal fan, she's absolutely blown away and she loves him. And now we're going to go and see him live. So it's a weird one. It's a very weird one. One band I didn't think about that came up on the list for the 2000s, I think it was Cradle of Filth. And they showed Midian, I think was early 2000s. What an album. Like every now and again I go through a Cradle of Filth resurgence. and just get back on them. Usually the weather's got to be shit, which it is today. So I might actually listen to Midian on the way to the studio to do stuff with the Office Blokes. I think I need to. I think I need to get Midian on. My first Cradle of Filth album was Bittersweets to Suck You By, and yeah, I used to sleep to it. I used to sleep to that and Midian, and my parents would come in my bedroom and like 5 in the afternoon where I finished school, I've come home, I've put it on really loud, and I'd just be flat out, and I'd think there was something wrong with me because I could sleep to like music that was so inconceivable to their ears. Interesting that though. I guess my journey with metal is now, I think it was probably like 1999 when I started getting into metal. Yeah, it would have been when I was about 13. So end of the 90s, I've had the whole 2000s, the whole 2010s and 2023 so far, the 2020s so far, to try and wrap my head around it. I agree with Bradley though, metal's in a good place at the moment. Like the new Cannibal Corpse stuff I've heard, absolutely amazing. The new Cradle of Filth stuff I've heard, absolutely amazing. But so many new bands out there as well that are doing big things. I think it's a great place. Metal will never die. It's one of those genres that it comes and goes in terms of popularity, but it'll never go. It'll never go. Firm believer in that. I'll be listening to metal until I'm grey and old, and then yeah, I'll croak it. Hopefully my kids listen to metal after that. So yeah, nice. Right, make sure you like and subscribe if you enjoyed that. If you haven't watched Bradley Hall before, make sure you go over there, like and subscribe as well, because he makes some of the best guitar-based content out there. It's awesome. Always a bit of fun, and he's a ridiculous musician as well. And he's got a couple of solo guitars there, which I've got a nice solo baritone guitar up there. So yeah, approved. Right, cheers for that, guys. I'll see you soon. Nice one.